zoom out and look at some of the wider issues in politics, because there have been arguments for years about whether the UK political system is getting more presidential, with a focus on the leader rather than the party. So what about the two main party leaders now? Just how much of an asset are they with crucial parts of the electorate ahead of the general election next year? Well, presumably next year. We're joined now by Tryl, who is the UK Director of More in Common, former government SPAD as well, who has some quite interesting polling on that, haven't you? So what's the main takeaway then?
Well, what we wanted to look at was how much of an asset was each of the leaders to their respective political parties. There's been this suggestion that although the Conservatives are in the polling doldrums, that actually Rishi Sunak's personal appeal might be enough to pull them over the line. And what came back was really interesting. So, first of all, voters agreed that Rishi Sunak was an asset to the party. They definitely thought, actually, he was better than the Conservative brand. But the interesting thing was when we asked the same question about Keir Starmer, voters were almost as likely to say that Keir Starmer was an asset to his party too. In fact, actually, what we tend to find in our focus groups is people tend to think the same things about both leaders, actually. They think they're both kind of competent, they're both kind of good at the job, but they worry that both of them are perhaps a little bit posh and out of touch with their lives.
I've got to ask the question. We're looking at some of that polling. You can see the overall very similar between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. But the popularity of the parties must come into this as well, right? So, you know, you might say, oh, I quite like Pep Guardiola, but if you really hate Man City, you're still going to want them to lose, right?
Absolutely that. You know, what is driving politics at the moment is perceptions of the two parties, and voters haven't suddenly given the Tories a free pass. You know, they remember what happened with Boris, what happened with the mini-budget, and that's driving the opinion polls at the moment. But I guess the Tories had this hope that perhaps if Sunak was far more popular than Keir Starmer, it might be enough to carry them over the line when people really focus on who do we want as Prime Minister. What that polling shows, certainly at the top level, there really isn't that much difference between the two of them.
That's really interesting. You've also broken it down into kind of key voter groups. I just want to have a quick look at some of this. I think we can show you one on the screen now. So this is loyal nationalists, effectively people in... Oh, sorry. Nationals, I should get that one right, effectively red wall voters. What's this showing?
Yeah, so this is the group of voters who swung behind Boris Johnson and delivered victory in the red wall. You know, they're traditionally Labour voters, but switched to the Conservatives after Brexit. And the really interesting thing here is that this group of voters, when you ask them if Rishi Sunak's an asset to the Conservatives, they say no, narrowly, but they say no. But when you ask them about Keir Starmer and whether he's an asset to the Labour Party, they say the opposite. So it's interesting. Amongst that group who will determine those red wall seats, actually more of them think Keir Starmer's an asset to Labour than think Rishi Sunak's an asset to the Conservatives.
And if they do define the election, as many argue they did last time...
If they define the election... And again, this resonates with what we hear in our focus groups, that Rishi Sunak, they really just wonder, does he really care about things like levelling up? A lot of the stories, you know, things about the swimming pool, the shoes, actually cut through with that group. And it's hard for him to be able to present that he really cares and understands their lives.
So that's a red wall. And we've been hearing more and more about the blue wall, right? So the kind of traditional Conservative seats that are now swinging away from them, sometimes the Lib Dems as well. This is what your polling showed when it comes to who you're describing, established Liberals, blue wall. There's quite a difference there between the two men, though.
Absolutely, and this is what's so fascinating. So this is your group. You might think of them as being like Cameronite Tories in the blue walls, so more traditional Tory seats in the South East. And if you ask them about the two leaders, they agree that both leaders are an asset to their party. But Rishi Sunak, they think it by a really, you know, it's actually quite a stonking margin. And what we've seen with that group of voters who didn't particularly like Boris, they didn't, you know, they actually tended to vote Remain, they don't really like the culture wars, they really like Rishi Sunak, and he started to win them back in large numbers. And I think that might be the Conservatives' hope with this presidential campaign. It might not be enough to save the party and win the election. It doesn't look like it'll be enough to help in places like the Red Wall, but enough of those more traditional Conservative voters might stick with them to stop it being a 1997-style rout.
It's interesting listening to you, though, because you're talking about those voters and you're saying they voted Remain, they don't like the culture wars. And I'm looking at the programme of government at the minute. There's a lot about stopping the votes. There's a lot about making Brexit work and not going back on Brexit. Why are they not trying to appeal to these blue wall voters? That they're focusing on the red wall voters who, if what you're saying is right, they might have already gone.
Well, this is one of the most fascinating paradoxes, that the group of voters who most like Rishi Sunak, if you actually look at his ideological profile, some people have suggested he's the most socially conservative Prime Minister we've had, at least since the 90s. It doesn't align with them at all. And we think there's a danger that by pursuing this kind of more culture warry, socially conservative strategy, that he doesn't win back those red wall voters who are particularly concerned about the cost of living and the NHS, but also these blue wall voters think, oh, God, he's not quite what we thought. Actually, he's more right-wing than Boris on stuff, and he loses them as well. So there's a real danger that the Conservatives find themselves falling between two stools if they're not careful.
What's your prediction, then? There's lots of chat about whether or not Labour's on course to win a majority, if they are more likely to be heading into coalition territory, if there is a landing zone for the Conservatives. Where are you at?
Well, look, what I always go back to is, this time 3 years ago, the Conservatives were on 55% in the polls. They're now at about sort of 28%. So this is a very volatile electorate. But I think the thing which does it for me is we asked people we polled recently to describe what they thought of Britain. It was for the New Britain project. And the top word that came up was broken. And until that changes, it's really hard to see a path to a Conservative victory. At the moment, if there were an election tomorrow, I'd be predicting quite a comfortable Labour majority. But there's a year to go. We've seen lots change already. More could still change.
It's really interesting. Thanks very much for coming on and talking us through some of your research. Thank you. You're watching The Take.